Do you speak crowdlending? Welcome to our podcast covering the crowdlending industry. Our mission is to provide you with all the insights from this market and help you make informed decisions. I'm Gassan, co-founder and CEO of Acredius. We are a crowdlending platform based in Zurich, Switzerland. I'm delighted to host this podcast and hopefully bring value to all our listeners. Hi everyone, I'm glad today to welcome Simon Amrein, a Senior Research Associate at the Luzern School of Business. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you. Hi.
So, Simon, we're here at our first episode. We want to inform our listeners more about crowdlending in Switzerland and even globally, and to get to know more about this industry. And I think you are well positioned to tell us more about it. But maybe first of all, I didn't take a lot of time to introduce you because I think it's best if you introduce yourself. So please, Simon, tell us more about yourself.
So, as you said, I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Luzern School of Business. And we are publishing one of the major market studies each year on crowdlending and how it develops in Switzerland. So I'm the co-author of this publication, which is called Crowdlending Survey. And then we also publish one survey each which is sort of on a broader level on crowdfunding in general, which is called the Crowdfunding Monitor.
Excellent. So, but Simon, what brought you to this industry? Why are you trying to find out what is crowdlending and publish numbers about this industry?
So being from a business school, we sort of realized in, I think, 2014 that there is something going on in the internet, that there are different projects, different companies, ideas being financed online. And we started to follow up on all these initiatives that we saw popping up online and try to capture sort of this market. So what we first did in 2014 was this publication that I mentioned before, the Crowdfunding Monitor, where we described sort of this new crowdfunding phenomenon. And back then that was sort of a market study about a market with a volume of, if I remember correctly, I think 12 million Swiss francs. So that was still a tiny market, and we were not really sure ourselves, whether this is going to take off or not. But I think if we look at the market figures now, and I'm sure we're going to talk about later on about that. I think it's definitely a market taking off. So it's becoming bigger and bigger each year. And ever since we've sort of followed up on these developments of the Swiss market.
So how was it? I mean, you were doing a study about a 12 million market. I mean, how did you decide to do it, and what were more or less the barriers to that, if there were?
So essentially, it was quite easy. I mean, we got in touch with all the market players. There were not that many back then, so that wasn't too difficult. We tried to sort of get in discussions with them, asking them also for data in order to get an idea about the market size. So to get started, essentially, to be honest, it wasn't that difficult, since it was like the really early phase of an industry, and people were and still are, I think, very much interested in having exchanges also with a university.
Excellent. So you say it's crowdlending. I mean, we say crowdlending, P2P lending, peer-to-peer. Can you tell us more? What is this crowdlending? I mean, it's like crowdfunding, right? Just asking.
Not exactly. So as you said,
I know. Thank you.
As you said, I mean, there's a bit of a confusion, I think, about all these terminologies. So you've mentioned P2P lending, you've mentioned crowdlending. You could also add marketplace lending. And these terms sort of are different terms used for debt-based finance online. So this is how I would describe it. different terms are being used over time or are being used in different countries as well. So nowadays, the term marketplace lending becomes more popular because it's sort of more encompassing, describing all sorts of business models that somehow have to do with online financing and debt capital. But in the UK, for example, P2P lending is much more popular. So it has to do with different traditions, using different terminologies, but it's definitely the case that marketplace lending is becoming more and more popular to sort of describe this online financing. And then there's crowdfunding, as you said, which is more sort of a broad term in the sense that it's about financing different ideas, projects, companies, private persons online. This means essentially that it includes also, for example, reward-based finance. So the big platforms that we know in the United States, for example, Kickstarter or Indiegogo. So these sort of platforms are reward-based crowdfunding platforms. There's also an area which is more about financing startups with equity capital. We refer to this as crowd investing. And as I said before, if we talk about debt-based finance, then we're talking about crowd lending.
So, I mean, I would add to that, I mean, to really see the difference between all these like sub-families of crowdfunding, it really depends on what you get back as an investor. So as an investor, if you're getting back a product, that's simply a pre-sale, that's the classic Kickstarter case. So it's crowdfunding. If you're getting back shares or parts of company, that's more for crowd investing. If you're not getting back anything, so that's more for crowd donating. Probably that's what we said. And then you get the crowd lending where the investor is getting mainly interest out of his investments, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of how we classify these different areas. And if we do that, we always think about the returns that you get for each area of crowdfunding.
So how does it work for crowd lending? I mean, I'm a company, have a great idea. I've been in the market for 5 years. Then I can use crowd lending to finance my next step for growth, right?
So that's possible. So essentially, you're just applying to a crowd lending platform. They will, if you are deemed to be a good company and that you're being able to actually repay the loan, then your profile will be uploaded to the platform, and your loan is going to be funded in the best case by a number of different investors, or by only one investor. That's possible as well.
So do I need to be a company?
Not necessarily. I mean, there are different areas within crowd lending again. So usually we differentiate between the three main sectors, which is consumer crowd lending. So in this area, we're talking about typical consumer loans that you can also get from consumer loan banks, for example, here in Switzerland. Then the second area would be SME financing. So typical SME in need of capital can apply for a loan. And then the third area, which is the mortgage sector. So you can also get mortgages through platforms.
Interesting. How big is this market in Switzerland and maybe globally?
So globally, it's a bit difficult because there are different studies assessing the market, and there's not basically a study for each market around the world. So there's no one big figure available. When we look, for example, at really advanced countries, we did that this year in our crowd lending survey. There we see, for example, that in the United States, the average capital invested through crowd lending or marketplace lending per capita in the US was about 120 Swiss francs. In the UK, we're talking about 90 Swiss francs invested per capita in this sector. And if we compare that to Switzerland, we're lagging a bit behind. So we're talking about about 30 Swiss francs invested per capita.
Mm-hmm.
So in comparison, the Swiss market is sort of smaller. If you take these leading countries as a measure of comparison, but then if you look at our neighboring countries, Germany, France, Italy, for example, Austria, then you can also see that comparably Switzerland is much bigger. So I'd say we're somewhere in between. We're certainly lagging behind these big markets, the leading markets, UK and the United States, but we're also ahead of our neighboring markets. And if we're talking about total volumes, the Swiss market last year was about 260 million Swiss francs. This year we're expecting it to be somewhere in the area of about 400 million Swiss francs.
So this year, 2019. Huh?
2019.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the biggest? What's the separation of the verticals? So the biggest market in Switzerland is more consumer crowdlending, mortgage, SME. I think it's SME, right?
So the business. So out of these 260 million Swiss francs in 2018, about 160 million Swiss francs were loans to businesses. So that's the biggest share, and then about 57 million Swiss francs is consumer loans. And then about 70 million Swiss francs is mortgages.
Okay.
So this is sort of how the shares are split up in Switzerland.
Okay, interesting. So this survey, this is the crowdlending survey that you do every year. Can you tell us more about it? So is it who are the authors? Who is financing this survey? And what's the purpose maybe of the survey?
So the purpose is essentially to improve transparency in the Swiss market. So that's our main concern. We want to make the market obviously more visible for the public, but also more transparent in the sense that it can create some trust, both for borrowers and lenders. So they get to know how the process of crowdlending works, what the main players are, and so on and so forth. The publication is a joint product by the PwC, the Swiss Marketplace Lending Association, and the Luzern School of Business.
Interesting. So the Swiss Marketplace Lending Association, I think I heard about them. I'm actually a board member of this association. You're yourself.
I'm the secretary.
Yes. So please tell us more. You're really well positioned to explain as the SMLA.
Yeah. So the main concern of the SMLA is really to sort of foster transparency as well, create trust, being able to explain how crowdlending works to the outside. So that's what we're doing here. So that's one area. A second area, which is very important as well, is that we sort of create a framework for risk and return figures. So one thing that we develop, for example, are common standards for measuring risk and return. So what we'd like to see in the future essentially is that certainly all of our members, but also the whole sector in Switzerland is using the same definitions for risk and return figures, because that creates sort of reliability for investors, so they can really be sure, what does a non-performing loan mean, how are returns measured, and so on and so forth. So these are very detailed topics, but actually it's quite important. And one thing that we do in this association is, for example, we collect and aggregate all the data for the Swiss market, so people can get an idea on how relevant the market is and what the risks are that are involved, but also the potential returns.
Very interesting. Since when does this association exist?
So we basically first discussions already started towards the end of 2017, and then we got online in 2018, starting to collect data, and we've been growing since then, essentially in the Swiss market. Yeah.
Very interesting. So, from your position now that you know, I think more than the majority of people in Switzerland about this industry, and also even globally, what would be your advice for someone wanting to go into this industry in from the borrower or the investor side? So what do you think one should look at before going into this industry?
So if you are an SME or a private person seeking a loan, I would look at the different platforms. I would look at the processes. How fast can I get a loan? Do these platforms look trustworthy? And also maybe if they are SMLA members or not. That's a detail.
Really? Yeah. Only SMLA
No,
members.
that's just advertising. But I mean, do check the platforms. Think about whether these people are reliable partners for your interests or not. And if you're an investor, I would specifically look at the transparency of platforms. So do the platforms disclose risk and return figures themselves, for example? Are these numbers reliable? I think these are all very important topics because, it's like investing in crowdlending is obviously like the financial interests are real. And that's understandable, and that's usually the main motivation for investing. But I think investors have a right to be informed about potential risks as well and reliable return figures.
But that's more or less also the job of the SMLA. I mean, not the job, but that's what the SMLA is providing by the fact that they are publishing these numbers, I think, in an aggregated level. So it gives an idea about how is the market doing, right?
Yeah, so we do that on an aggregated level. But I mean, nevertheless, if you're an investor, you would like to know more about the individual platform as well. So we take over this role on the aggregated level for Switzerland, and then it's up to the platform to disclose whatever they want to. Yeah.
Interesting. I still have one out-of-the-box question for you, but maybe to close more or less the topic, is there any fact you would like to share from your current work, or anything related to crowdlending as an industry, or any thought to our listeners?
Well, if I think about the Swiss market and how it develops, it's sort of, I think it's a very dynamic sector, and that's what makes it very interesting. So we have lots of startups in that area that are engaging in this market. We've seen lots of market growth in the past. So for me personally, it's super interesting to be part of that experience and of that growth, and to get some insights, get to know people, and see how this whole dynamic plays out. And then obviously it's also the interesting question is, how does it develop in the future? So if we talk about market growth, 40, 50%, that's impressive, and that's a lot. But essentially the main questions that sort of we are asking ourselves is there going to be an even stronger takeoff at some point? And the key question there is, for example, will the platforms be able to compete with banks in the loan markets? Yes or no? What are sort of the conditions to be able to compete with banks in that market? Because I think that's one of the key questions that also a lot of platforms think about. And there's a huge market.
Yes.
So if you talk about SMEs, that's about 300 billion Swiss francs outstanding volume in the balance sheet of banks, and I think that are really the key and interesting questions for the future.
Great, that's great. Thank you very much, Simon. I still have one last question for you. I know you somehow prepared yourself for it, so that's why I'm changing it. So, what's your favorite fruit, Simon?
My favorite fruit. Okay, it's a challenging one. So,
by the way, I did not change it, so please, Simon.
So in general, I like fresh fruit in a tropical country. So the favorite fruit always depends where you are. And
without boundaries.
Closer you get to the source, the better the fresh fruit is. And if it's fresh, I'd like to have a fruit juice, which is a mixture of all kinds of different fruits that are fresh.
Yeah, but you still did not answer the question.
That's an
I'm sorry.
unsatisfying. You know, it's all about diversification. I think that's the important part. So a diversified fruit juice.
You do not want to take a decision.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, if I had to take a decision, it's probably pineapple.
Pineapple.
I like that a lot. But always think about diversification. It's the same if you're investing, right?
I totally agree. I like it. That's the key. So even though you like pineapple, I would say the key is diversification. So make a smoothie with different fruits, and you will be safe. Thank you very much, Simon. It was a pleasure to have you here for our first episode. Thank you very much for your support and for explaining what is crowdlending to our listeners.
Thank you. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks again for staying with us until the end. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media so you never miss an episode. Please don't hesitate to send us your questions and comments at agridius.ch. Thank you.